I just think people get so discouraged and they think truth is lost, times of crisis will never be able to survive this. Just be like the people in history who believe that Jesus is the truth. Be the very best you that you can be in whatever vocation you're called to. And then God does the work. I come away from this feeling a lot more optimistic than when I started.
Hey there, folks. Welcome. As promised, my guest right now is Dr. Jeff Myers. He's a friend. He's the president of Summit Ministries. As an educator and entrepreneur, he's become one of America's most respected authorities on youth leadership. And he's been praised by people like James Dobson. Hey, if Jim Dobson thinks that you're something, you're something. So I want to say to Dr. Jeff Myers, welcome back.
Eric, great to be back with you.
I'm amazed you have another book out, a new book. It's called Truth Changes Everything. And that is itself simply true, right? That when you're dealing with truth, it affects everything, it changes everything, it touches everything. So what is this book about? I mean, it's a fascinating title, but what's the subtitle?
Well, the subtitle is How People of Faith Can Transform the World in Times of Crisis. So looking at the times, I just thought, I want to go back in history and see, has it ever been this bad? And it turns out it's been a lot worse at various times in history than what we experience at the present time. And it was people of faith who stepped in and really changed the whole course of the world. And it was the truth as found in Jesus. So they believe truth exists. Truth exists as a logical proposition. It exists in mathematical formulas, but it also exists in a person. It's Jesus. And people who believe that Jesus is the truth are the ones who gave us modern science, the arts, education, our justice system, our political structures, everything that we take for granted that we don't want to lose.
That is an amazing thing to hear you say. I'm saying similar things everywhere I go because I think that there are many people who it's really bad theology. They seem to think that the truth of Jesus only affects us in the religious sphere. It's a theological thing. I'm just going to preach the gospel. And you think, wait a second. No, if you bring the gospel of the kingdom into the world, it changes everything. Slavery will get abolished. Science will be invented. Most people are unaware that the truth that is Jesus will change everything. So it's one of the reasons I was so happy to see the title of your book, Truth Changes Everything, because we are living in times where people need to get this, need to understand that if you're living your faith out, you're going to be doing more than simply leading people to Jesus. You're going to affect everything, and the people whom you lead to Jesus will themselves affect their own spheres. And this is something you're saying it's played itself out in history. Talk a little bit about that, because some people just aren't aware that this is true.
Well, if the amazing thing is when you look back at history and you just ask the question, who was this Jesus follower and what did they do and how did that change the course of the world? It's stunning. There are about 75 stories that I'm able to tell in the book. I thought about you a lot as I was telling these stories, and I thought, I'm going to be sure to tell stories that Eric hasn't told in his books, and there's some fun ones in there. But John Wycliffe is a really good example. He was a professor at Oxford University. He wanted to translate the Bible into English. At the time, that was just not thinkable. Latin was considered to be the perfect language. If you translated the Bible from Latin into English, it would be like adding curse words every third or fourth word. So they didn't want to do it. But he said Moses heard from God in his own language. The disciples heard from Jesus in their own language. The people today need to be able to hear from God in their own language.
Moses didn't speak Latin. Jesus didn't speak to his disciples in Latin. It's kind of interesting, but it's kind of bizarre, isn't it? How culture warps people into thinking there's nothing to discuss. It's got to be in Latin, and how it's revolutionary. It was revolutionary for John Wycliffe to suggest this idea, and he got in trouble, risky. A little trouble.
Yeah, that's right. He could have been burned at the stake for this. But it is typical of each age that we think we're the best that's ever existed. But he had to really standardize the English language in order to print the Bible. A lot of people don't know that he actually invented 1,100 words in English, including the words mystery, communication, persuasion, even the word wordy, to put the Bible into English He's thereby standardized the English language, which became the number one trade language in the world, and it still is to this
Jeff,
day. And the entire course of history has been changed.
I love nothing better than learning something new. What you have just said to me, I'm a little bit astonished that I have never heard that before. That is an amazing thing that John Wycliffe, by translating the Bible from Latin into English, invented words. Now, by the way, we know that's exactly what happened about 100 years later when Luther translated the Bible into German. He sort of created the modern German language because there were all these dialects and he had to kind of do what hadn't been done before. But you're telling me Wycliffe himself did this with the English language. I'm ashamed that I've never heard that. That is wonderful to know.
Well, as many books as you've written on history, I'm glad I can share a little bit of new information. But you think about language itself. When people say today, speak your truth, instead of saying, as we used to, seek the truth, they're saying there's no truth that actually exists. And that's now a majority viewpoint. The balance has now tipped. And most of the people in this country now say that truth is up to the individual. If that's true, then there's no point in even communicating that or talking about it, because our words have no meaning if there is no such thing as truth. So it starts with language. But in the book, I just go on to science. You've told a lot of those stories as well. The arts, a fascinating story that I had never heard told before, just about how beauty can be communicated through Jesus followers and how that can literally change the course of artistic history. So it's fun. We can individually make a difference.
Talk a little bit about science. I mean, in my book, Is Atheism Dead? I talk about some of this, but I want to hear from you because it's so it's really against the spirit of our age. The spirit of our age, really, since the Enlightenment, many people have bought into this lie that science and even reason are somehow at odds with faith. We know that's not only not true, the opposite is true. Our faith is what enabled us to do science and so on and so forth. But you talk about that in this book?
I do. There are different ways of knowing. Science is a way of knowing, but history and theology and philosophy are also ways of knowing. The Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who was the Jewish leader in London, very well respected, passed away a couple of years ago, said science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. So there's a difference between the two. But if you look back at the history of it, and Rodney Stark, who was a recently passed a historian and sociologist at Baylor University, he said of the 52 individuals whose inventions and discoveries constituted the foundation of modern science, only one of them was an atheist. 50 of them were known to be believing Christians. Well, how? Why? Well, because they believed that the world actually exists, first of all. Second, that the world is not a God. There is a God. He made the world, but the world is not God. So you don't have to worry about studying it. Third, there's a stability in the world because there's design. If you do an experiment at time A and an experiment at time B, you're actually experimenting in the same world, which is not something the ancient Greeks were confident of. And on, all of these assumptions are either consistent with or derived from Scripture. And it took people who not only believe that truth exists, but that truth is personal. Truth is Jesus. If Jesus is the truth, then he wants me to be the very best scientist I can be. Some cool stories. The story of Robert Boyle, the founder of modern chemistry. That kid could have turned out to be a trust fund baby. I mean, he grew up in this 20,000 square foot castle that had been built by King John. His father had purchased it from Sir Walter Raleigh. And he said, no, I'm not going to live that way. I have all the money that I could ever need, but I'm not going to live that way. In fact, he wrote a book called The Christian Virtuoso, How to Be an Experimental Philosopher, that was his word for scientist, and be one who glorifies God and loves Jesus at the same time. These people did not see a conflict between their science and faith. In fact, it was their faith that made their science possible.
And Boyle invented, I always forget the branch of science that he invented, but these are as seminal as it gets. I mean, without these folks, there is no science. Modern science was invented by profound men of Christian faith. We need to know that. We need to say it over and over and over again to those people who would lie and distort the truth and claim somehow that faith is at odds with science. That's not even close to true. That's what I kind of find so funny, Jeff, is that it's the very opposite that's true. In fact, John Lennox has said that it is atheism that is incompatible with science. We need to make that case, that if you're an atheist, you don't believe in meaning, you don't believe in transcendent truth, you don't believe in truth. What do you believe in? Why would the universe make sense? Why should you examine it and expect it to make sense and reveal its secrets? Why shouldn't it just be absurd? We need to push those who purport to be atheists and say, you're not making sense. And it is, as you just said, absolutely Christians who invented what we call modern science today. We'll be back. We're talking to Dr. Jeff Myers. The book is called Truth Changes Everything. Folks, welcome back. We're talking to our friend, Dr. Jeff Myers, who's written a book called Truth Changes Everything: How People of Faith Can Transform the World in Times of Crisis. So, Jeff, this is a book of stories, and I love that. It's great to communicate in stories. Tell us, who are some of the figures that you mention in this world and how their faith came to transform a certain field or a certain period in which they lived?
Eric, one of my favorite stories in the book, and one that I had not heard told before, was of Antonio Vivaldi. He was a priest, not very good at his job because he was so consumed with music. He would, in fact, be conducting a mass and just leave right in the middle to go write down some musical passages. And the head of his diocese took compassion on him, said he can't help, he's not in his right mind because he's a musician. And he wondered how he could take his Christian vocation, his calling to be pastoral, and his desire to be a musician and put them together. Well, Eric, he ended up in Venice becoming a composer for orphans. There's a large orphanage in Venice called the Ospedale della Pieta. Thousands of boys and girls would be dropped off there because they had physical defects, or maybe their mothers were involved in prostitution.
Ospedale della Pieta.
Ospedale della Pieta.
Where is it? In Florence, Venice?
It's in Venice.
In Venice.
It's in Venice.
And what time period did Vivaldi live in?
So this is the early 1600s.
Okay.
Well, the boys could go out and get a job at age 16, but what about the girls? There was no potential for them. Many of them had physical defects. They had all kinds of difficulties. They would end up on the streets. They didn't have enough money for a dowry, so they couldn't get married. So he turned them, Eric, into the finest orchestras and choirs in all of Europe. And I was first read in Rousseau's book, The Confessions. He mentions having gone there, and you kind of trace this back and you realize Vivaldi became a great composer because he had to compose so much to keep all of his choirs and orchestras of orphans busy. And they literally traveled. They traveled throughout Europe. They became the most famous musicians of the age. And Vivaldi became so productive as a result. Writing a concerto, which is an orchestral piece that features a solo instrument, is like writing a book. It's very difficult to do. Well, he wrote 500 concertos that we know of. And many of them are specifically designated as having been developed for certain performers who were in his orphan choirs and orchestras. In one 6-year period, he developed a new concerto every 2 weeks. So it's this great convergence of ministry and music, where he became a great composer because he had to fulfill his ministry. These young girls received a purpose and a sense of direction in life they otherwise never would have had. And now we know of the Baroque period of music as having transformed the whole musical landscape for all of history. And it was Antonio Vivaldi, along with Johann Sebastian Bach, who did it.
I was going to say, and he would have been a contemporary roughly of Bach's, and Bach was a man of tremendous Christian faith, who created some of the greatest music that's ever been created. And it really did come out of his faith as well. He wasn't just, because we have this idea, this modern idea of the artist that goes off and expresses himself. But these were men of profound faith. And writing, in the case of Bach, it was it was church music. It was ecclesiastical music. It was meant to draw people closer to God, and some of it is obviously the greatest music ever. So you talk about music, you talk about science. What else do you talk about in this book? It's called Truth Changes Everything.
Yeah, and Truth Changes Everything. I decided we have to tackle politics. I get it. I know a lot of people think that it's just so irritating to keep talking about politics over and over again. But, take for example, the founding fathers of the United States. Of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, 51 of them, possibly 53 of them, were known to be believing Christians. And of the larger group of 204 founding fathers, virtually all of them were members of Christian denominations. Now, obviously, going to church doesn't make you a Christian, but it does change what you look at for your founding sources. And one political science history professor, Donald Lutz, looked at 15,000 documents the founding fathers quoted from, and he found that they quoted from the Bible more than all of the others put together. Now, a lot of people today think, we have the freedom to reject God in this country, and God's, we say, sure, we pledge allegiance, and God is here and there, in God we trust, but that's all just historical stuff that doesn't really matter. But to the founders, it made a great deal of difference because they thought there were principles in the law of Moses that could help make a great society. Now, Eric, I majored in political science in college. No one ever told me that. No one ever told me that it was the law of Moses, the 10 Commandments and so forth, that formed the basis of the greatest nation on earth. But that's what happened.
Well, or they act like it's kind of incidental, that it's not central. And I wrote a book called If You Can Keep It, where I really discovered in the course of writing that book what you're talking about in this book is that it is the truth of the Bible that leads us to be able to be self-governing. So anybody who thinks, I think self-governing and liberty, it's great stuff. What does it have to do with faith? Whether you like it or don't, it has absolutely everything to do with faith. And even if you're not a person of faith, you need to know history, and you need to know that this is true. You need to know how it works, how it came about, and how it could not have come about otherwise. You need to do the math. We'll be right back talking to Dr. Jeff Myers, the new book, Truth Changes Everything. Hey there, folks. As you know, most people in America are under the delusion that truth is kind of up to the individual, that it's subjective. There's no such thing as the truth, that it's your truth or my truth, which most of us know in 5 minutes you can figure out that doesn't make sense. Either 1 + 1 = 2. Either there are things that are either true or aren't. But we've kind of the zeitgeist tells us, well, that's an old idea. It's not an old idea. It's called truth. Truth is not something that's malleable. What your favorite ice cream is or your favorite color, those are things that, we can have different opinions on. But there is this thing called truth that's come under attack. So it's one of the reasons I'm so proud of my friend Dr. Jeff Myers with Summit Ministries, has written a book called Truth Changes Everything. So, Jeff, let's talk about some more of the stories in Truth Changes Everything. What other spheres have been affected by men and women of faith?
Well, if you trace back even things like justice, so it probably goes without saying, but if there's no such thing as truth, there's no such thing as justice. Justice is only your opinion. It is kind of like the ice cream that you choose to eat. And Peter M. Sorokin, who founded the sociology department at Harvard University, said, look, if you give up on the idea of absolutes, the only thing you have left is physical force. So you end up in a brutal kind of world just because you don't want to acknowledge that truth exists. Now, that doesn't make it easy to find. But people, I went back into the 1940s. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States was in a position of having to try the Nazis. Well, what were they going to try them based on? Because the Nazis' defense was everything we did was inside of our sovereignly controlled territory, and so it was our nation. You can't tell us what to do. And by the way, by what standard are you going to judge us? Are you going to say there is an absolute standard of right or wrong? Or do we all get to decide what is true for ourselves? And the American prosecutors were seized with indecision in this situation. They didn't know how to approach it. What they finally decided is, basically, because we won, we get to judge you. Well, which begs the question, if the Nazis had won, would they get to judge us?
Yeah.
You see, and that was the situation they went through. Out of that time came the United Nations Charter for Human Rights. And if you look at it, it's really interesting. It says there are certain rights. These are just human rights. Humans have this value. But if you look at the introduction to the document, it says, because the signing nations agree on this, it is true. Not because it's actually true and we have discovered and now know that it's true, but just because we agree on it, which obviously means if they didn't agree on it, it wouldn't be true. So you look all the way back, and there's some amazing people in history. Hugo Grotius is an example. This guy was a child prodigy, developed what we think of as international law. You look at people like Samuel Rutherford, who was a Presbyterian pastor, wrote a book called Lex Rex, The Law is the King. King Charles II was so angry at him, he sent his soldiers to arrest him. He was going to bring him back to London, put him on trial, give him a fair trial and hang him, as they say. And Samuel Rutherford died before the soldiers arrived and said, I have been summoned by a higher authority. Those were his words on his deathbed. But that book, Lex Rex, all of a sudden, the horse is out of the barn. The king is not the law anymore. The law is the king. All of that, Eric, was the heritage of Christians who just believed that Jesus is the truth. Because in Greek times, yeah, truth exists, but you can't discover it because there's nothing personal about it. It's so other. It is so out there. But it was Christians who came along and said, no, truth is right here with us. It changed the way they viewed human nature, changed the way they developed medicine and charity and all of these things. Catherine of Siena is one of the people I talk about in the book. Just a wonderful story of a woman who ran toward people who were dying from the plague rather than away from them. And she was asked, why? Why are you doing that? You're going to die. Why are you running toward people who are sick? And she said, well, Jesus is with the suffering and I want to be with Jesus. So if you want to be with Jesus, you got to go toward the suffering, not away from them. And I think that's what we need to do in our own time. Engage, not escape.
Well, I mean, of course, this is the history of Europe, the history of the world, is that the Christian faith more and more finds its way into every sphere and then transforms the world. I mean, hospitals were started by Christians. Most people aren't aware that all of these things that we now somehow take for granted, they didn't always exist, and that people of faith brought them into existence. When we talk about self-government, when we talk about respecting the individual, the sanctity of human life, all of these ideas come out of the Bible, and it took many of them a long time to come out of the Bible and to overtake the lies and the confusion. But it's undeniable. It's the history of the modern world. And it's just so funny that we're living in a time when people are divorcing the things that are really the fruits of Christian faith from the Christian faith and then setting them at odds with the Christian faith. I mean, you could see this in the world of medicine. We now have doctors and medical professionals practically bullying women into aborting their children or into suggesting that a young woman have a sex change operation. It's an extraordinary thing. Once you become unmoored from the truth of God, it's an awful thing. So it's kind of important to me that you've written this book, Truth Changes Everything, because we need to remind ourselves of what is true and where we get what we know to be good, where it came from.
That's exactly right. No nation has ever gone as far in the direction of error as ours has gone and survived unless it reclaimed truth. And who's going to do this except for people who not only recognize the truth exists, the facts are there, science and history are real, but that Jesus, as a person, came into the flesh, and he is here with us, even in the times of crisis that we face. That's the hope of the Christian message. And Eric, it is there. Brian Grimm's a very well-respected sociologist. He found that if you take all of the things that Christians do to make the world better, it adds up, in America alone, to $2.67 trillion of economic value. That would make it about 20% of the United States economy. There are 130,000 addiction recovery programs at churches in the United States of America. You go on down the list and you think Christians are doing the right things, but don't get discouraged. Don't think that in times of crisis we just have to give up because it's all over.
I want to come right back to the point you're making. We just got a short segment, folks. Don't go away. The book is Truth Changes Everything. Dr. Jeff Myers of Summit Ministries. Hey there, folks. Talking to our friend Dr. Jeff Myers with Summit Ministries. The new book is Truth Changes Everything. Jeff, at the end of the last segment, you were talking about something, and I thought we need to give that a little bit more time. Please say that again, what you were saying. It's so important.
You know, Eric, I've heard a lot of people say, well, that's all Christian history, but Christians today aren't doing anything that really makes a difference. And I was mentioning that there's this well-known, very well-respected sociologist named Brian Grimm, who just decided to look at that. And he found that if you add up the economic value of all the things Christians just in the United States are doing, it adds up to $2.67 trillion of economic value every year, which would make it about 20% of the United States economy. There are 130,000 addiction programs that are based in churches in the United States of America. The United States government gives away about $33 billion in aid to the overseas poor. American Christians give away $44 billion every year in economic aid. So we are doing a lot of the right things, Eric. I just think people get so discouraged and they think truth is lost, times of crisis, we'll never be able to survive this. Just be like the people in history who believe that Jesus is the truth. Be the very best you that you can be in whatever vocation you're called to. And then God does the work. I come away from this feeling a lot more optimistic than when I started.
Well, listen, the negativity and the hopelessness that a lot of Christians are kind of giving voice to, it is sinful, folks. It is wrong. We are in a battle. And if you cannot be a happy warrior, praising God in the midst of the battle, if all you can do is say, we're losing, have you seen the polls or whatever, who cares? Your job is to do the right thing with joy unto God, knowing that he's going to use it. And I really have to say, Jeff, that so many people who have that attitude, they're actually making the problem worse, ironically, because they're saying, well, what's the point in fighting? We've lost the battle. You will lose the battle if you don't fight and if you have that negative attitude and you always focus on these negative things, because everywhere I look, I get invited to all of these events where I'm the speaker at something. Recently, I was in Houston speaking at an event for the Mighty Oaks Foundation. Unbelievable heroes, a guy named Chad Robichaux. They bring the love of Jesus and the message of the gospel to warriors dealing with PTSD. It is an overwhelmingly successful ministry, completely funded by Christians who believe in giving to help those who are suffering. And I thought to myself, the good that one organization is doing, all of the pregnancy centers around the country, everywhere I look, I see hope. I see people living out their faith. It's what you just said. People living out their faith. It's not going to be covered by the New York Times. They are living out their faith. They're putting their money and their time for God's services to help strangers. And it's a beautiful thing. And we need to know that that's God's will for us. We're not supposed to sit on our hands and complain and think, well, I better get my beef jerky and my water purification tablets and go hide in the caves because we've lost the battle. We've not lost the battle, but if you have that attitude, we may lose the battle because of that attitude. The book is Truth Changes Everything. We just got seconds left. For whom did you write the book? This is for the average reader. This is not for youth ministry, obviously.
No, this is for people who wonder what difference they can make in times of crisis. And the message of Truth Changes Everything is times of crisis are the very best time in all of history to stand up and speak the truth. We live in the best time imaginable.
Amen. And God calls us to this battle for such a time as this. This is a book of hope. Truth Changes Everything by Dr. Jeff Myers. Jeff, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.